Hey everybody, Ozark Gilman here. So I'm going to talk today really quick about how the DNA of the people of Mexico, their DNA ancestry, if you will, came from all over the world, and specifically about how all that got there. Because a lot of people from Mexico, especially if you're listening to this in English, the title obviously, you're probably living in the United States. You might be curious where you come from, all that. People specifically in regions of Mexico are part of communities, ethnic communities, especially in their regions. Hundreds of thousands of people around them in that region will be much more ethnically close to them. Of course, very likely people living in the U.S. Their parents might have come from different regions, therefore they will have different, ethno communities based on the region they came from, or even, especially very common these days, different different Latin American areas. The predominant and largest common ethno group is Spaniard, European, but almost all the other various DNA that people wonder about. It's not unusual to have a small percentage of sub-Saharan African, maybe about 6 or 7%, maybe even max. It's not unusual to have 2 to 3%. That can vary a lot depending on region, but you will find that all over Mexico. To have a very small percent of sub-Saharan African DNA that was basically from the Atlantic slave trade. It's much more common in other regions and other places of the this world region, Haiti, Belize, areas like that. But in Mexico, again, the admix means that different groups combined happened very, very long ago. So it's very, very rare to find someone predominantly of African ancestry. Again, it tends to be a very small percentage. The people in northern and southern Mexico, this is the most vast difference ethnically. The Amerindian groups, that's what I'll call the groups, the ancient tribes, they're pre-European, if you will. Northern Indian, you're talking like Aztec, and then Southern Mexican Indian, you're talking like Mayan. These two groups, it's very important to point out, interesting fact, are actually very ethnically different from each other. You're talking they're more different than modern day Europeans and East Asians. Um, so again, that is makes a very big difference in language, culture, ancient geopolitics, all that. And on this channel, this is a bit of a departure from what I usually do. But I cover demographics, culture, geopolitics, all that. That study has led me to this. Mexico is especially fascinating though, because if you're wondering why, some of the North African ancestry, Middle Eastern, perhaps Sephardi Jewish showed up on there, conflicts in the past and expulsions and everything have led to this. In the early 1600s, Spain, that was after several centuries of Moorish Muslim conquest had occurred in Spain. Um, the Spaniard Empire expelled who they called Moriscos. Those were the North African Moorish Muslim descendants or entire villages and all that were expelled from Spain. Most of them went back to northern Africa, but some apparently went to Spain, as that commonly shows up in the more European DNA. And almost all of the non-Amerindian DNA, it's important to point out, almost all came by way of Spain. It's not unusual at all. There was some very small scale immigration from, Scotland, Ireland, England. If that shows up on a DNA test as that, it probably didn't come by way of Spain. That probably was actual immigration from those regions. There are some very small regions with some Italian immigration and all that. In northern Mexico, especially people who get ancestry done whose ancestors were from northern Mexico, typically are very shocked to find out that there are a very large majority European. Anywhere from 2/3 to 75%, some even 80% or so. The large majority of Mexico's population, about 75%, are what would be called mestizo, what I'll refer to what's commonly known here in the United States as mestizo. That's typically an admixture of European and Amerindian. And again, that's about 70%, 75%, maybe even up to 80% of Mexico's population, depending on the sources you look at and all that. The DNA data starting to show patterns and everything. A lot of it was self-reported. Only about maybe 7 to 10% of Mexico's population reports themselves as being Amerindian. In other words, they tend to speak the language, are part of the tribe, the indigenous language and all that, the pre-Spanish language. Perhaps another small percent are vast majority, Amerindian, but maybe have culturally assimilated to the broader Mexican Spanish-speaking culture as well. In northern Mexico, it is going to be large percent, anywhere from sometimes half, but usually 2/3, 75, 80% European. You'll also be surprised sometimes to find some North African, Middle Eastern. Again, the Sephardi Jewish population has picked up some, Middle Eastern, North African, and European DNA, but it will probably show up as Sephardi Jewish if it does. They were largely expelled from Spain. Some of them were called conversos. They were forced to convert to Catholicism and may have come over with the general Spanish population. Others may have been forcibly expelled from Spain. It was written in both the Muslim and the Christian historic texts that the Jewish population opened the gates of Toledo, allowing the Moorish invaders in. So, of course, there was a lot of interethnic conflict there because of the centuries of oppressive rule by the Muslims in a predominantly European Christian nation. Of course, Spain expelled them. Now, some people in far northwest Mexico, especially the Baja region, you might be surprised to find some South Asian ancestry. Sometimes people might think that's due to a lot of similarity between the indigenous Amerindian population and Asian DNA. Well, there is some similar DNA there, but the South Asian ancestry, although it's kind of a very small percent and sometimes rare in that region in particular, people speculate and historians are thinking and speculating and setting up on this, but it's probably from there was a slave trade when the Spanish controlled the Philippines and other regions of South Asia. So again, some of these pieces of DNA, putting the pieces together here and the historic events, kind of showing you, how different expulsions and all that people might have sought refuge in Mexico or were brought to Mexico. And that tends to be, and down south, the further south you go, the more Amerindian it gets. The further north you go, the more European it gets. It's not unusual in northern Mexico. You could be about 75% European, predominantly Iberian. You'll find some Portuguese, Italian, sometimes English, Scottish, etc. Mostly Spanish, and then you'll find a little bit of North African, Middle Eastern, etc. By the ways I just told you, and then you might find about sometimes 20, 25, anywhere from 15, 20, 25, 30%. Usually on the high end Amerindian. Most northern Mexicans, as I've said, are shocked to find out they're not more Amerindian, that they're a large majority European. And that's because, by way of Spain, just look at Antonio Banderas. Spaniards tend to be, even though they are ethnically, Indo-European like the rest of Europe, they live in a warmer climate. A lot of times they did not develop the, lighter features like you might find from most northern Europeans, of which, most old stock Americans like myself are descended. That's why a lot of times, like Antonio Banderas, it might be kind of hard to tell just from visual appearance if somebody is predominantly Indo-European from Spain, or if they, have a decent percentage, large percentage of Amerindian ancestry. Again, a good way, you can look up different celebrities and all that with these Ancestry DNA results. Kind of shows you the variety you get, but again, they tend to be homogenized in the different areas. More European with some Amerindian ancestry in the north, much more Amerindian, large majority Amerindian with some European ancestry in the south. With some outliers, again, like I said, you'll find, North African, Middle Eastern, Sephardi Jewish, etc. Now, down south, it's very common to find people, it could be 80, 90% Amerindian, some almost full-blooded Amerindian. They would predominantly ethnically perhaps identify as that rather than mestizo. It's kind of up to, individual what culture and background and everything you came from. But this tends to be the ethnic makeup of the region. So again, for me, Mexicans living in America, people with Mexican ancestry, you do have homogenized regions, just like the old stock population here in the United States tends to be very homogenous based on the different regions you go. But with different parents coming from different communities, you will, of course, have half of your ancestry from those regions reflecting those, admixtures, which might explain some of the unusual things that you're shocked to find this DNA from all over the world in there. So I hope that kind of sums it up for you, maybe makes it make a little bit of sense, because I don't see anybody really analyzing this and talking about where this usually came from and summing it up kind of nicely, describing the different regions for you. Again, hope that kind of does it for you. This here is Ozark Gilman. You'll have a good one.